Coming up next, Ni Hao, Kai Lan. Coming up next, Ni Hao, Kai Lan. Coming up next, Captain Underpants. Coming up next, Mr. Men. Coming up next, Pocoyo. Coming up next, Pencilmation. Coming up next, Mr. Cat. Coming up next, The Mr. Men Show. Coming up next, Bentley. Coming up next, Brother Herman. Coming up next, Fernando the Evil Cockroach Wizard. Coming up next, Carl the Evil Cockroach Wizard. Coming up next, Evil Con Carne. Coming up next, Infinity Train. Coming up next, Evil Con Carne. Coming up next, Infinity Train. Coming up next, Spencer. Coming up next, Spencer. Coming up next, Special. Coming up next, Spa. Coming up next, Cyborg. Coming up next, Coach. Coming up next, Grandpa. Coming up next, Grandma. Coming up next, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. Coming up next, The Grim Adventures of Kids Next Door. Coming up next, Nestle. Coming up next, Dynasty. Coming up next, Nestle. Coming up next, Dynasty. Coming up next, Rudy. Coming up next, Ruby. Coming up next, Snap. Coming up next, Happy. Coming up next, Fizz. Coming up next, Taffy. Coming up next, Steven. Coming up next, Spaghetti.